The divorce papers sat on the kitchen island like an accusation wrapped in official letterhead. Nina stared at them as if they might change into something softer if she concentrated hard enough, into a wedding invitation, a check, a receipt for promises kept. The house around her smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and Hunter's cologne, fresh, serious, a little sharp. 3 years. No touch. The phrase had lived inside her like a bruise, both a rule and a monument. "Nina," Hunter said, his voice even as the steel in his cufflinks. He did not look at the papers. He never looked at the papers first. He always looked at her, and the look carried the patience of someone who had rehearsed not being moved for a very long time. "Sign it." There it was, the blunt demand that had been rehearsed in private calls with lawyers and rehearsed behind closed doors with the family elders. You either dissolve it quietly or we hold. The Quinn family would be displeased. Money and land were a choreography their families understood without speaking. The Shaw side, her side, had their own ledger. Everything was transactional until it wasn't. That had been the point from the beginning. Contract, dowry, reputation. Nina's hand hovered, then fell to the paper as if weighted. "We were married 3 years," she said, not a question. "No touching for 3 years. Everyone knows that. Why now?" Hunter's jaw moved minutely. "Because you filed for divorce." "I filed statements," she corrected, "because accuracy was always a weapon she knew how to wield, and because I can't pretend this is anything but an arrangement that's falling apart. I wanted to end it before reputation turned into rumor, before someone decided to rewrite our marriage into a scandal." "Is that what you think I want?" His voice stayed quiet. "To steal your dignity in public?" He sounded hurt in a way that did not match his reputation. The words struck a chord. People believed Hunter Quinn had despised displays of sentimentality as a business risk. He had built a company out of restraint, and that restraint bled into his private life until it became law. It made sense the way he presented himself. It was the reason they were married in name and signatures and schedules. It was also, it turned out, what made his being tender so dangerous, because tenderness, when it occasionally leaked, looked like betrayal to everyone who didn't know how long he'd been holding his breath. Nina laughed, short, brittle. "Don't be melodramatic." "You say that like melodrama is something I invent." Hunter finally glanced at the papers. "You know the terms. You signed them. You promised." She did not point out that the promise had been hers to make because of debts she was trying to rectify for her family, because there were people depending on the land she hoped to save for Weston. Weston. Just saying his name felt like a foreign taste at the back of her throat. The man she had loved since they were children, who had once promised to leave the world with her by the canal if nothing else worked out. Destiny, she used to think. Foolish then. Useful now. "I promised because it saved them," she said instead. "You and your family got the east parcel as part of the settlement. My grandfather gets the pension. Weston'll have a shot at opening the ranch if I can push that purchase through." Hunter's expression shifted in a fraction, muzzle thin, but it was small, and she'd learn later how deliberate he'd trained that smallness to be. "So you married for Weston," he said. Not a condemnation, but a reading of terms. Business up front, sentiment shoved under the carpet. "For Weston, and because if I didn't, my grandmother would lose the house." She looked directly at him then, and the honesty in her gaze felt dangerous. "You didn't make me do it. You didn't force me. We both knew the price. We both made a choice." His hand lifted to the paperwork, the signature line demanding consequence. "Sign it. Let the lawyers close the book." She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to tell him that it hadn't just been strategy, that nights existed between their counted obligations when she'd imagined the wrong things, when she'd felt childish and foolish and alive at the mere possibility of him cracking. She wanted to tell him the truth, that the no-touch clause had been negotiated to calm 2 fierce, needy families, and that the coldness of the arrangement had been the cost she paid for a window of safety for Weston and her grandmother. Instead, she pushed the pen away and rose. "I'm not signing in a room that smells like your cologne and your patience," she said. "If anyone's going to end this, I want it to be clean." He watched her walk out. Hunter had always watched. It was one of the things that had wrecked her when they'd first met, the sense that someone could gather you with their attentive quiet. For a decade he'd watched, and the watching had become a religion. 3 years, no touch, that's some austere romance energy. SVIP show-off really doing the cold CEO bit. LOL, imagine a marriage contract like a tech acquisition. The chat intrusions were silly, but they were also true. The world stamped everything human with a label and queued up to gossip. Nina had grown used to being viewed, catalogued. Even now, the house felt like a stage, even when it was only the two of them and a pile of legal forms. That night, Melody arranged the bachelorette as if she were setting a war table. Bachelorettes in her social orbit had a ritual of faux reckless freedom, champagne, teased dancing, a $1 bill in a bouquet like confetti. Melody wore a smile that was all intention and no warmth. She had always been fun when she wanted to be. She had always used fun as leverage.
"This is the last time I'll have to celebrate anything that includes a contract," Melody shouted over the music, the words a dare. Nina's phone buzzed with Weston's name, and then with Candace. Candace, who had been a friend since first-grade math class, and who had the kind of loyalty that read like armor. Candace squeezed through bodies to press a glass into Nina's hand. "Drink slower," she mouthed. "I saw Serena by the bar looking shifty." Serena's reputation preceded her, a girl from the other side of town with a history of being in the wrong place at the right moment. Not a wife, but a woman with ambitions and rumors circulating like satellites. Nina smirked and set the glass down. Later, she'd think she should have listened to her own instincts. The club was loud, the kind of loud that swallowed things whole. Melody had a mouth that asked for attention and a voice that demanded an outcome. "You're going to sign it, right? Or you're staying for the show." People chanted like it was a game. Someone shouted Weston's name. Someone meant to needle, and the crowd took the bait. A chorus of names like hands in a heartless weather. At first, the drugging wasn't cinematic. It was a thickness to the air, a slow film haze. The second drink felt silky. It was like swallowing syrup. Nina felt her jaw go heavy, like she'd pulled a pillow over the thought of thinking too sharp. Melody leaned across to tell her something, and her words came in tiny bubbles. She blinked and realized she was slumped, then sitting, then leaning, as if someone else were arranging her into a state of passivity she had not consented to. Candace's face tensed into a portrait of rage. "Who?" she began, but by then security had already formed a ring, and the club had Vanimal alarm. Someone touched Nina's arm with aid and concern. Someone else laughed. The chorus got louder. A viral clip found its way to 10 phones and then to 100. A hand fumbled for a camera, because there would always be angles before accountability. Nina's memory of the next moments was fragmented. Sky, chair, Candace's voice, a soundless chorus of bodies. She remembered a boot, Serena's silhouette, a male model stepping in like a mirror of Weston's old face, a prank that meant to be comic and felt like a dare. Someone was filmed whispering something that sounded strangely rehearsed. The clip that made the rounds later would show Nina slumping, then blank. It would show a man, later called the model, mockingly holding a faux ring up to a camera, and somewhere in the blur, someone pushing a bottle into her hand. A hand, firm, controlled, impossibly warm, grabbed the back of her jacket and steadied her. His voice, near and low, was the only clear thing in the fog. "Nina, Nina." It was Hunter. She could have sworn he materialized like a professional storm, composed, furious, perfectly placed. He was not supposed to be here. Quinn rarely made public appearances where there was noise and loose ends.
He was supposed to maintain distance. "Get her out," he barked, quick and efficient. His whisper to the security staff was like a command. Candace clung to Nina, and someone had shoved them toward the exit like a tide parting. Outside, the air hit Nina like an admonishment. The neon was too bright. The city smelled like exhaust and spilled perfume and small betrayals. In the back of Hunter's car, the world shrank to his hands on the steering wheel and the throb behind her eyes. He drove as if he was taking her away from a battlefield and into a sanctuary. The limo smelled like leather and something else she recognized, the coffee they used in boardrooms on long mornings. He had brought her home before like this, not with the drama, but with the same sureness, his hand steadying the back of her skull so she would not fall. There, in the low light, he looked vulnerable, but not in the way she'd anticipated. His jaw was tight and his knuckles white. He didn't ask why she'd been drugged. He didn't ask who had put a bottle near her. He simply got her indoors, into the bedroom, onto the couch, and sent Candace to fetch a medical kit. He called someone, his PA, a doctor, and spoke in clipped sentences that made her head swim with shame and relief at the same time. The next morning, the world had its own hunger. There were videos with shaky camera angles, the club clip, a snippet of a man, mocking the idea of Weston, and Hunter's silhouette like an interrupted column of control. Social feeds blinked, and the day's headlines were already forming.
People loved moral catastrophe because it felt like clean entertainment. Oh my God, he showed up like a knight, KLR. Is that Weston look-alike for hire? She got drugged? This is messy. Nina's head ached. The edges of memory were sewn with interruptions. She remembered waking up in Hunter's spare room with a glass by the nightstand and Hunter gone. She remembered checking the couch and seeing the imprint of him where he'd been sitting, like a fossil of his shoulders. She remembered being ashamed of her body for reasons that belonged to the people who had filmed her. She called Candace, who answered with a string of expletives and a promise of vengeance. Candace's voice was fierce. You need to tell someone, not just Hunter, the cops. You can't. She was interrupted by a text from Weston that appeared like a stone in her pocket. Saw the videos. Call me. The words were small and reckless. Nina typed and deleted a reply. She did not want to show weakness in front of Weston, not when she had spent years trying to preserve him like a fragile plan. She also did not want to drag him into a scandal he had nothing to do with. But Weston would always be her litmus test. His reaction mattered in a way that made no sense to her adulthood self. It mattered because boyhood promises had weight, and because he had a way of making the world feel simpler. Align your compass, point west. You are home.
Hunter returned carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He had been awake. She could see it in the way his eyes were rimmed. He was a man at the end of weather that had lasted too long. He set the mug down in front of her carefully, as if cupping a fragile memory. You were drugged, he said, and the sentence was not a question. I don't remember. She drank because the liquid anchored her. I remember the club. I remember waking up here. Candace said someone stepped in. She said she saw a guy doing some stupid prank. He did not, could not, ask the question that buzzed in her like a small insect. Did you sleep with me? She asked it before he could. Did we? He inhaled like a man avoiding a blade. You were ditched into my car unconscious. I brought you home and stayed with you. I called Candace. I called your doctor. I made sure you were hydrated. I did not leave you alone. There was an intensity in his answer that felt like both a shield and a confession. He had been there. He had not exploited. That was what the world needed to hear, and she meant it when she felt that relief. But there was another side to the truth. The rumor mill didn't care if it was fact, only if it was juicy. People are already saying things, Hunter added quietly. There are clips. The model prank went viral. Someone put a caption, "She finally folds." Nina laughed, a small sound of disbelief. Of course someone would write that. Melody's name was attached to one clip, he said, the mention like a charred thing. Melody had a talent for setting fires and watching people singe. Her account had it linked to her stories within minutes. She tagged Serena. Serena would do anything for attention. Nina tried to sound casual and mostly failed. The undercurrent of panic hummed. The land, Weston's chance, her family's security. If the Quinn elders saw this as a scandal they could use, as leverage or as reason to pull out, the East parcel could become a bargaining chip. Hunter's phone vibrated. He answered briskly, and the tone on the other end made his face harden. Quinn Corp emergency, he mouthed, then said, I'll be there. He hung up. Board wants to discuss a statement. He paused. My grandfather's health has been discussed. It's not the best time. The Quinn family, his family, saw reputation as currency with interest. They would not like a bride turned into a spectacle. They would not want any whisper to threaten their holdings. There were meetings to be held in rooms whose blinds never lifted. He would have to be present, and yet he had also promised, without words, some private attention that had been accumulating like steam. Nina watched him leave the room and then listened to the hum of the city below the windows, like a reminder that nothing private here could stay private for long. Her phone buzzed again. An article, a headline with a blurry picture of her stumbling. A comment thread unfurled, ready to diagnose and assign blame.
She thought of Weston and pictured him reading the headlines. Would he call her reckless? Would he be angry she'd risked everything for him? That old fear. He'd always been the restraint to her fire, the steadying anchor. Her chest ached with guilt she could not rationalize. She's playing chess and forgot the rook is on fire. CEO-led rescue? Heart eyes. The internet loves a messy marriage. Later that afternoon, the Quinn board meeting stretched into a ritual of decision-making that felt designed to be merciless. Hunter sat at the head of the table with a face that had learned how to be composed when people needed to see control. They wanted a statement. They wanted a distancing. The corporate counsel advised caution. The PR director suggested deflection and a calm tone. The elders worried about the appearance of impropriety more than a woman's welfare. Their concern was the ledger. Hunter listened, fingers steamed. He spoke when necessary, economy wrapped in a suit. We will issue a statement confirming that Ms. Shaw was the victim of an incident at a private event. We will encourage discretion. We will not engage in speculation. His voice was smooth. It was the voice he used when the market wobbled. It was not the voice that spoke when the thing inside his chest unclipped and bled. He excused himself not because the meeting demanded it, but because there was another meeting he hadn't scheduled, one in his living room with his conscience. He found Nina alone on the balcony, the city bending away like a wound. She looked at him, and looked younger than she had in years, lined by stress, but oddly brave. "You could have let them drag you through," she said, meaning the board, meaning the social feeds. "You could have said nothing." He was quiet a moment. "I can't have you going through that without being safe," he said, and the words landed like stones. She saw it then, the truth that had been sitting between them for years like an unlit candle. Protection could be possession when wielded by certain hands. Hunter had always folded his protection into a cloak that might have been symbiosis or ownership. She had been certain for a long time that she did not want to be owned. "But you agreed to the arrangement," her voice wavered. "You agreed to—" "I agreed to a contract," he corrected. "I did not agree to let you be harmed." The way he said it made her think of the nights when he had watched from across rooms, the times a glance had felt like a rescue, even when nothing dangerous had been present. There had always been a distance, then a devotion, both fed by something older than either of them could name. "You always look like you're measuring cost," she said. The accusation was light, but it was true. Hunter did have a way of measuring human contact like a balance sheet, accounting for risk, profit, collateral.
"Because someone has to," he said, and his grip on the balcony rail betrayed the sort of quiet that people mistake for emotional flatness. It was not flatness. It was calculation that had a fever underneath it. Late that night, Candace insisted they go to the police station. Nina resisted, tired of being the strange woman in the middle of other people's opinions. But the thought of the video circulating, the idea that someone could file a version of events that made her complicit, convinced her to go. The police took a report with a mechanical kindness, asked questions that pried, wrote down dates and times. They took a blood sample. Protocol, they said. Melody, ever the spark, continued to stir. She sent Nina a message, words of performed concern that dripped like syrup, then linked a story where the club's management denied any wrongdoing, their statement thin as tissue. Serena's name kept surfacing in comments attached to the video, a smear of suspicion that made everything worse. Nina found herself explaining again and again that she had been drugged. The old, small, ashamed part of her fretted over whether people would believe she was a victim. The world liked a clean narrative. Gullible woman, predatory world, hero saves. It didn't like messy things, affection that couldn't be categorized, arrangements with many layers, motives tangled. When she went back to the house, she expected, absurdly, that the night would have been a threshold that shifted something large, that the simple fact of being rescued would alter the dynamic between them in a clarifying way. Reality, stubborn and coarse, slipped under the door. Hunter was not a man of grand gestures in public. He was a man of small, deliberate acts in private. He held a bowl of soup to her lips later, the way some people hold a fragile bird. He did not ask for explanation, nor did he force one. He had never been a man to demand confessions, only to collect them when they were offered. "Do you want to file a restraining order?" he asked. The question was practical. He did not employ the word protect because he assumed she would sense it without the jargon. She shook her head. "No, not yet. I need time to think. And if someone thinks to use this for business leverage..." He cut her off with the kind of look that she recognized now as the part of him that could be soft and devastatingly precise. "You will tell me first." "You want to be the man who controls the narrative," she said, "because sometimes it's better to name things as they were rather than let them fester." "I want you to be safe," he corrected. His voice was shaded with something raw she hadn't heard before. "I want you to be free from harm.
And if that feels like control, then I'll try to do it without becoming the monster you fear.
The way he called the monster by its name made her think of the times her own manipulation had been a tool for survival. It made her think of how the two of them had wielded power differently. She with negotiation, he with silence and presence. At some point in the haze of the next morning, a text from Weston arrived. "Meet me. 9. The old barn." Her chest accelerated. The old barn. Dust. Horses. The place where they had mapped out boyhood conspiracies and swore that when the world closed in, they would leave for a place where stars were not blocked by neon. Weston's plan had always been simple and fatalistically romantic. A ranch, open land. Nina had been trying to secure funding for that very idea, to redeem the boyhood vows. But the current scandals could complicate everything. Don't go public with him, she thought. But then, how do you arrange safety for the man whose name still tastes like home? She found herself torn among many small emergencies. A family meeting at the Shaw house where Melody would surely whisper poison into ears, Weston's text like a hand on her heart, Hunter's expectations framed with a care so protective she sometimes found it dangerous. She agreed to meet Weston. The barn smelled of hay and the summers of their youth. He stood by the fence, coat tight to his frame, sun catching in his hair like a halo he never intended. He looked at her as though she were a question he'd been trying to answer for a decade. "You were in the video," he said. He did not sound angry. He sounded hurt in a way that cut deep. "I know," she said. "It was a mess." He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that was a man folding the land beneath his feet and deciding whether to trust its yield. "You okay?" She wanted to tell him everything in the language of bargaining, the strategy, the dowry, the land, the reason she had traded a touch for a promise. She wanted to say she'd done it for him, for his future. Instead, she said, "I'm trying to be." Weston's hands were the hands that had taught her how to climb fences and count stars. "I don't like their eyes on you." It was not a jealous pronouncement as much as a protective one. "You know I'll back whatever you need." "And if I don't want your backing?" she asked sharp. Because the truth was messy. Acceptance meant pity sometimes, and she could not decide which she wanted more, his help or his complete indifference. "We'll do it together," he said. "But you have to promise me one thing. If this blows up and they try to use you, don't handle it alone." Yeah, she swallowed. Was she going to handle it alone? Hadn't she been handling everything alone for years? The narrative pressure closed like a hand around her throat. The town was a living organism now, gossip as its bloodstream, and she felt watched from corners she could not see. The Quinn and Shaw families both mobilized in ways that made everything feel like a chess game on a board that had nothing to do with them as people. At night, Hunter's balcony gaze returned to her many times, and sometimes she would stand beside him, both of them looking at a city that did not know how to be gentle. He didn't touch her. The rule had been agreed. The law of their marriage was still technically in effect. 3 years, no touch. People speculated about why. Some said political. Some said a test of will. Some whispered about an old promise. The fact was that the no-touch clause had been a wedge both protective and punishing. "The board's talking about separation if this continues," Hunter said quietly one dusk, his fingers tracing idle patterns on the glass. "I don't want that. Not because I want the arrangement to persist, but because it will be used." Used how? The rest of the sentence sat unspoken, full of ledger lines and interest. He'd loved her for a long time, 10 years, if you believed that kind of timeline could be measured. But his love had been silent and contained. The unexpected night had splintered that containment. In him, something unspooled that she could sense but not fully see. The vulnerability that had made him human. The fact that this wasn't just another corporate problem to be solved. When the morning after the rescue dissolved into responsibilities, she found herself facing an even more scandalous element. She couldn't remember part of the night that followed the rescue. She could remember being in his car, then waking up on his couch, and then the blank spaces. She told herself not to be ridiculous. Memory gaps could be trauma, could be drugs, could be the body shutting down. She told herself to be reasonable. But when she recounted to Candace that she felt like she'd lost the thread of the night, Candace's face hardened. "We have to consider everything," she said. She suggested a private exam. "You need to know what happened." Nina nodded, terrified of what she might find. The thought of data and tests and the cold reading of hair and blood made her feel like an object in an experiment. It also felt like a necessity, a way to reclaim a story. Narratives were weapons,
and right now she needed to be the one to write the first chapter. That afternoon, she sat across from Hunter at his kitchen island again. The same divorce papers lay where she left them earlier, a neat stack like an accusation. She hadn't signed. The world around them hummed with a kind of impatient curiosity. Melodies of rumor ticked through town. Candace had dropped off evidence bags, and Weston had texted to see if she needed him to pull together funds. Melody had liked a story with a winky emoji. "You could leave," he said softly, the possibility both offered and withheld. He always offered, in his way, choices that let her keep her dignity. "If you want the divorce, I won't stop you." She looked at him. There it was again. His offering of choice felt like indulgence. "I want the divorce," she said, but the words came out less like a decision and more like a performance.
"But I don't want to be the one left holding the checklist of damages," he exhaled. "We can talk terms." They sat like that, two people who had been arranged like pieces and who had learned to move with one another. He had no theatrics, she had no illusions. It should have been the end. The baseline expectation of their private arrangement would be preserved. But the night had changed something. Maybe in him, maybe in her, maybe in the way the Quinn family would view a scandal, maybe in the way the town would taste gossip. 3 years, he murmured, almost to himself. No touch. "Yes," she said, feeling both the anchor and the chain in that phrase. 3 years, no touch. They were arranged to live side by side with a rule that kept them strangers in flesh, but neighbors in need. But rules break when pressure builds, and sometimes an unexpected night can crack a surface enough that what's underneath comes spilling out. From the balcony, the city blinked, and in the quiet between them, a promise of trouble and possibility fractured the evening like a ripple. Chat. Plot twist. One night and the CEO turns into a soft kettle. Vote, does she sign the papers? If he cries like a kettle, I'm dead. She didn't sign. She left the papers in the light, folded like evidence. Instead, she pulled a sweater over her shoulders and walked to the room where Hunter kept books he rarely let anyone touch. He followed her with a quiet that was heavy and necessary. "You should leave," he said again, softer this time. It was the language of a man who understood that sometimes not insisting was its own violence. She set her fingers against the spines of the books, and the suddenness of a laugh rose from somewhere surprised. "You're making me sound dramatic." "You are," he admitted, and something like a crack appeared in his composure. He leaned against the jamb of the doorway, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the tug of something personal in his posture. "I don't want dramatic for you. I want—" He paused, searching for a word that felt like it had been trapped for years. "For you to be safe." The rawness of that confession unbalanced her. It wasn't a declaration of staking claim. It wasn't the usual corporate rhetoric. It was a quiet, desperate want. He had been protecting something indefinable for 10 years. Maybe it was her well-being. Maybe it was the shape of what he'd imagined their future to be. Maybe it was the accumulation of days spent noticing small things about her. The way she laughed, the way she tucked hair behind her ear, the way she strategized when cornered. She almost asked him why he'd never told her, but the question was petty and inadequate. Instead, she said, "We both made choices when we signed those contracts. If you're hurting because of what happens now, we can talk." He shook his head, and when he moved across the room, it was slow, purposeful. He did not reach to touch her. He had not once since they'd signed a clause promising abstinence. His hand hovered. She could feel the heat of his breath. In that small space between them, something shifted, less seismic than subtle, like a small current altering course. "I don't want you to leave because of a scandal," he said, the sentence falling between them like a soft plea. "I don't want you to leave because you think you owe someone the kind of courage that isn't yours." "What does that mean?" she asked, because sometimes his metaphors required translation. "It means I'd rather fix things properly," he said bluntly, "not burn the house down to escape the smoke." And for a moment she saw him as other people did not the implacable CEO, not the quiet man who kept his feelings like a ledger, but as a person worn thin by something private. The image startled her. Tears she hadn't expected rose. The last 3 years had asked a lot of both of them. Sacrifice, strategy, a hard silence. Tonight had cracked that silence. She laughed,
This time it was not brittle. "Maybe noble is the wrong word," he admitted, "but I've been holding a thought for 10 years. He hesitated. "I thought it would never be the right time." Mina blinked. "Hunter." He looked at her like the person who kept quiet had just chosen to speak. "I don't want to lose you to rumors," he said, not the words she'd expected when he spoke of holding thoughts. "Not when I've already lost so much just by not saying things I felt." Silence followed, long enough to be in action. It was messy and imperfect and wholly human. The night that had started as a scandal had not yet decided whether it would become an admission or a wound. Outside, the city honked and continued its small cruelties. Inside, two people who had been kept apart by a clause found themselves facing a different negotiation, one of truth, of safety, of the messy business of asking whether what had been arranged as a deal could become something more honest. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from the Quinn board. They wanted a statement by noon. Her stomach lurched at the idea that her life would be summarized into a line item. She exhaled. "We do the statement," she said. "We tell them I was a victim of being drugged. We tell them to stop the speculation." Hunter nodded, but he was not making a promise. He was, instead, restaking invisible territory, the proposition that they could navigate this without destroying each other's futures. It felt fragile, but there was something in his resolve that suggested he might mean it. There would be other storms, Melody's whisper campaigns, Weston's jealous fury, the board's ledger. There would be late nights' explanation and small acts of tenderness and the slow, deliberate work of regaining trust. Tonight, for now, they were not signing away their marriage on an island of paper. They were choosing to respond. That choice mattered.
Outside, a string of onlookers continued to debate, laugh, and share pixelated gossip. Chat, the slow burn is on. He said he loved her in the quietest way possible. I need that boiling kettle cry moment next scene. The night hadn't fixed anything. It had, however, broken a surface long welded by habit. The 3 years no touch clause still hung between them like a rule that both protected and punished. But something inside Hunter had shifted, and something in Mina had too. A line of conversation had opened, the kind that could lead to reconciliation or to ruin. The divorce papers remained where she'd left them, unsigned, fluttering slightly in the draft of an unresolved house. The next move would be theirs, but neither could pretend that one unexpected night hadn't changed the lyrics of the song they were both pretending to know. She watched him leave the room with a softness she'd never allowed herself before. A promise was not yet spoken, but the possibility of being wanted in a way that wasn't just possessive hovered there. The day ahead would demand choices and statements and the kind of public polish that could erase allegations or amplify them. Yet in the private space left behind, Nina felt something like the first small bud of a different future, if they both chose to water it. And in the quiet, as she slid into bed across the room he had left, she could have sworn she heard the sound of a kettle somewhere far away, a small, urgent rattle that suggested pressure and the promise that if released, steam would rise, revealing what had been kept hidden for too long. If this is the part you clicked for, stay with them. This night is the hinge. The Quinn board wanted distance. The headlines wanted a spectacle. The feeds wanted a verdict. Nina had wanted a clean break. The universe had delivered a messy hinge instead, and now everyone wanted a turn at the lever. When Hunter walked into the boardroom that afternoon, it felt like walking through fog into a room of knives. The elders sat with the practiced patience of people who had watched balance sheets more than children. Their faces were granite, their words measured to make the market hear an echo. PR wanted a formal, restrained statement. Counsel recommended cautious language. Someone proposed that Hunter's grandfather release a brief note about family privacy to close the story. Hunter listened, nodded, recited corporate sound lines until his jaw ached. He returned to his office, and the steam hit like a physical thing, pressure waiting to be released. He excused himself from the last lawyer's point with a clipped, "I understand," then closed the door
and let his composure fracture with the slow precision of a machine cooling too quickly. He was alone for less than a minute before the sound came. Soft, a rattle like a kettle about to whistle. He should have kept it in.
He had kept it in for 10 years, folded into board reports, turned into an asset of restraint. But the night before, watching the city judge her, seeing her on the couch with a cup of coffee, the quiet of her insomnia made something in him unravel. He pressed his palm to the window, and the city blurred. He thought about the 3-year clause as a clean, rational solution to a messy set of obligations. Keep hands off, keep reputations intact, steer clear of scandal. It had been a law they both signed with different reasons. He had thought it would be possible to keep that distance and the distance safe. The rescue had changed rules that had sounded permanent. When the kettle finally let out its sound, it was a small, wet sound from his throat that surprised even him. It was the first uncastrated emotion he had allowed in a decade. He tried to swallow it, but it came anyway, hot and soundless, and he let his head drop into his hands. Kettle cry incoming, I called it. CEO tears hit different. Nina wasn't on his timeline. She had been navigating her own storms, phone calls from Weston, tense exchanges with Candace, a family meeting where Melody lobbed thin grenades of accusation the way some people toss pebbles at windows. But she kept hearing Hunter in the back of her skull, the way he'd said, I don't want you to leave because of a scandal. There was a gentleness in it, the kind that didn't flatten into ownership. It felt like a fissure in a dam that had been holding in all the things he hadn't been ready to say. Candace had spent the morning doing what she did best, turning worry into action. She had tracked the bartender's schedule, pried a CCTV angle that hadn't yet been pulled offline, rung 3 numbers until someone answered with, I'll check. She moved like a junkyard dog with a purpose, tenacious, loud, morally indignant, and part of Nina wanted to hug her, and part of her wanted to clamp her mouth shut and let the dust settle. But proof mattered. Proof that she had not been performing. Proof that something had been done to her. The medical report arrived an hour later. It was clinical and neutral and terrifying in its way. Sedative traces consistent with a benzodiazepine were present in Nina's system. Timeline markers suggested she had been given a dose in the club that would impair cognition for several hours. The word non-consensual sat heavy on the page when Candace read it out loud to Nina in the kitchen, and Nina's stomach convulsed with the shame the world heaps on victims like an extra coat. I don't remember, she said, because memory felt like a private thing under glass. Telling it out loud made it a public artifact. That doesn't mean things happened that you didn't consent to, Hunter said when she told him, voice level as if he were quoting policy rather than a man whose insides had been hollowed with fear. She remembered the moment in his car when she blinked and the city slurred into something softer. She remembered waking on his couch with a mug of coffee at her lips and the outline of him somewhere between her and the door. But there were blanks she couldn't map. Memory had become a jigsaw with missing pieces, and every attempt to fit another piece in made her head throb. Did we? She'd asked him in the fog the morning after. You were unconscious, he had said. I brought you home, I called help, I stayed. The lab reports clarified the medical facts. She had been drugged, she had not been sexually assaulted at the point the tests covered, and no forensic evidence indicated intercourse during her incapacitation. That was an important line to draw, but it did not take away the way she had felt, frayed, used, exposed. Nor did it fix the rumor mill. The PR statement Hunter released at noon was designed to be as neutral as possible, a recognition of an incident, a request for privacy, an affirmation of support. It was a shield as much as a shield can be, but within hours the internet had already threaded the event into patterns it liked. She was the pawn, he was the knight. Someone would make 1,000,000 takes to keep their followers. Melody continued to perform like a one-woman campaign. She posted a string of stories, a combination of faux concern and cleverly tagged clips, very quickly, very surgically. People began to speculate she was orchestrating damage control for the Shaw family, that she was planting narratives. Serena's name, meanwhile, bubbled in comment threads tied to the club footage. The feed had a way of making possible intentions into certainties. Candace, not content to wait for the sleuth show, went to the club with Hunter's legal team and watched footage that had been pulled from the security vaults. In one slow-motion clip, a silhouetted figure leaned close to Nina's glass. The hand was ambiguous, but Candace's jaw tightened.
In another, a woman moved too deliberately between the bar and the table. Faces were blurred. The night had been organized to hide detail. "She looks like she was right there," Candace told Nina, and the word "there" was a direction that opened the world into moral outrage. Serena was called in for a conversation. She arrived with a face that had practiced innocence and a story prepared for every accusation. "I was trying to get Melody's attention," she said. "I saw a man trying to take a shot. Someone was being silly. I didn't." Her voice wavered for a second. "I didn't put anything in her drink." The police had already said they would follow the evidence. In the meantime, the accusation hung like static. Melody, for her part, was rapid fire and damage control, the kind of person who would plan a distraction and then act outraged that anyone thought she could be malicious.
At the Shaw household, where family dynamics had always been messy and public, Melody's version of events had become an artful performance. She spun the tale of a woman of complicated loyalties, Nina endangering the family's safety for personal gain. She hinted, through barbed comments and well-placed screenshots, that Nina's emotional ties to Weston complicated her judgment. Nina had to sit through a dinner that felt like a courtroom. Her grandmother watched with the quiet disappointment of someone who had loved her fate into a ledger. River, sat with a skepticism that had calcified from years of watching words become weapons. Old accusations floated up like ghosts, and the room felt heavy with the way history repeats itself in families that survive on leverage. "You married to save us," her grandmother said at one point, words like a benediction that also carried a wound. "You were clever, and now you look like a woman who took a risk that cost her respect." "I did what I thought would keep the land," Nina said quietly. "I did what I thought would let Weston have a chance." "And what if the price is you?" Melody cut in. "What if it is you who pays the debt, not the one who benefits? What if your husband—" "Stop," Hunter said sharply, stepping in like a line in the sand. He had not been invited by the Shaw household, but he came anyway because the barn and the board had become the same battleground, and he was tired of watching people weaponize her. "This isn't a trial." Melody's lips thinned, and the room hummed with the energy of people waiting for a verdict. Families sprang into the habit of choosing sides because it simplified moral mathematics. It is easier to pick than to sit in the uncomfortable middle, where truth usually lives. Weston, when he showed up at the meeting, had the sort of quiet that did not need spectacle. He had come with a fund proposal, a practical plan to secure the western parcel through a mix of private loans and municipal incentives. He looked at Nina as if he were surveying a field he wanted to plant, steady, stubborn, determined. "Let me handle the land," he said to her in the hallway, not loud, because his anger had the patience of someone who spent days fixing fences. "Let me get the funding that will not depend on someone else's headlines." She wanted to say yes and also scream. She'd been holding his future like a fragile object and expecting him never to shake. "You can't—" "Yes, I can," he said, with the kind of calm that had been born of 1,000 small decisions on the ranch. "But not if you keep letting people drag you into fights that don't help. We do this clean." They left with a plan. Hunter, after the board's meeting and his private unspooling, made a different kind of plan. He went to his grandfather's room and found the old man resting with a thick sunbeam across his knees. The grandfather had the same controlled gravity and sleep that he had in negotiations. Hunter's voice was low.
"They want to distance us," he said. Not to complain, but to make an observation. The grandfather opened one eye and looked at him like he was appraising a balance sheet. "Families choose currency, Hunter. Sometimes it's love, sometimes it's reputation. Don't let them confuse a currency for a life." Hunter left with a clarity that felt like frost. He could do the family thing, release the statement, let PR walk the soft perimeter. Or he could be human. He had the leverage the Quinns seldom used. The family name didn't only belong to the elders. It was a ledger he could influence by, if needed, showing the board consequences for the kind of public shaming they were treating as a business risk. He called the board back, asked for one more hour, and then spoke differently. He proposed a joint statement that acknowledged the incident, supported Nina, and promised cooperation with authorities. He also asked for restraint from public gossip. It was a different tone, less defensive, more human. The elders bristled, but the market did not collapse. People liked humanized tragedy as long as it had a neat fence around it. "Because she was harmed on our watch," he said when someone protested. "Because our response will define what we stand for."
No one said the word love in the room. You did not say it in places where words were assets, but it hovered in the air like steam, unquantified, real. The real confrontation came later that night in a place the house rarely used, Hunter's attic room, an odd vaulted space lined with books, a place he went to escape the polished world below. It was late. The house was quiet enough for confession. He had called her up, not with strategy, but with an honesty that had been hard-earned. There was a point where both of them had more courage in private than they did in company, and that point had become a battlefield where they both surrendered more than they bargained for. "You were drugged," he started, and then stopped, because it was a fact that had been said and resaid. "And I was furious that anyone would do that to you, furious that our life could be thrown onto the market for entertainment." She sat on the edge of an overstuffed chair, a kettle of feelings she kept tamped down on the stovetop. "I'm angry too," she said, "angry at whoever thought they could use me for a stunt, angry that I'd let my plans involve people like that, angry that I still—" He watched her then, like the man who had kept his feelings in a ledger and finally gave them line items. "I loved you for 10 years, he said. The sentence was not music, it was a simple balance. 10 years of noticing, 10 years of standing on the sidelines while she lived boldly and messily, 10 years of measuring damage mitigation like it was oxygen. He said it without flourish, because he had practiced restraint and didn't know how to do spectacle.
She did something she had not allowed herself to do much. She let a small sound out that could be a laugh but was closer to a sob. "You never said anything." "I thought it would compromise you," he replied. "I thought if I declared anything, they'd weaponize it. I thought they would use me as leverage to quote-unquote protect you, so instead I made silence my strategy." "But silence hurt me," she said. "Silence felt like a wall. It felt like—" She stopped because the words were difficult. "It felt like ownership." He swallowed. "I didn't see it that way until last night, until I watched you on that couch and realized that not saying things had turned into a way of protecting my own inability to be brave." He stepped closer, and for the first time the line between them felt like a measured fabric rather than a legal clause. He did not touch her. The no-touch rule was still a physical law between them, but his eyes were a kind of touch. "Why the 3 years?" she asked, surprising herself by asking the practical question that had been a wedge between them. "Why agree to that? You could have said no." His laugh was brief, almost rueful. "I didn't say no because it solved everyone else's math. It wrapped the Quinn's concern and the Shaw's desperation into a thing that we could manage." He paused. "And because I was a coward." She let him say it. He didn't mean the infidelity of the heart. He meant the infidelity of silence. He was honest, brutally so. "I love you, not because it rationally benefits anyone, but because I've been carrying your smallness and your recklessness and your stubbornness around like part of my own daily requirements." She wanted to run her hand over his cheek. She didn't. The rules hung like laundry between them. "Do you think love can be revealed like that?" she asked. "Like admitting it now will change anything?" "It changes the ledger of choices," he said. "It changes the terms of our mistakes. If you know someone loves you and they choose you, that feels like being protected again," she said, a tremor in her voice, "which is different from being chosen." He nodded. "I know. I don't want to protect you in a way that suffocates. I want to be part of the way you choose to live." They had been circling the real thing for so long, dangerously close and disappointingly far. It took the bluntness of crisis to turn their circular negotiations into direct conversation. She told him about Weston, about the plan to secure a piece of land so his dreams wouldn't be a casualty of the headline cycle. She told him about the nights she'd spent mapping how to get him a chance, about the small lies she told herself to make the bargain feel less transactional. He listened, and his patience was no longer a shield but a choice. "It's not one person's story," he said finally. "We both signed this because of our families and their ledgers. We both paid a toll. We both get to decide what happens next."
The attic felt like a small theater of truth. They traded stories, small, embarrassing fragments, and quieter admissions. He told her about an evening when he had sat outside a charity gala and watched her from across a room, how she had laughed the loudest, and how it hurt him like an unkept promise. She told him about the nights she had imagined leaving him with a clean paper, and how that thought was both relief and grief. The boiling kettle moment came when he told her about the way his father had once framed love as a liability. He had come to believe that showing emotion was market risk behavior. Tears came then, not theatrical, but private, the kind that had been boiling for a decade and finally found a release valve. They filled his eyes quickly and unexpectedly. They were warm and ridiculous and human. Kettle cry achieved. She had never seen him like this. The public Hunter had been a column of control. The private Hunter was cracked and vulnerable. Watching him change from the inside made her feel something complicated. Affection, sorrow, the ruin of being known with the small details she had always kept private. It also cracked something in her. The urge to manipulate as a survival tactic softened where tenderness took hold. They argued, briefly and sharp. The argument was the kind that rearranged furniture, words about autonomy, ownership, the thin line between protection and possession. He said things she had feared, and he apologized for them. She admitted with less theater than usual that she had sometimes used other people's expectations as a tool. It was not a proud admission, but it was honest. They did not consummate anything in that attic. They did not break the 3-year clause in the heat of confession. They negotiated language. They set boundaries. They came to an agreement that felt like a pilot version of trust. 3 months. Not a fairy tale ending, a trial. If we're doing this, Hunter said, steady now, weary and serious. 3 months of trying. We stay married, but we also get help. Therapy. Open calendars. No secret meetings. If either of us breaks the code, we reevaluate. She laughed. A soft break of a sound like someone letting air out of an inflatable raft. Legalese for try not to destroy each other, she said. He half smiled. Exactly. It was a truce made of pragmatic love. No grand gestures, just mutual agreement. The 3 months weren't a balm for everything, but they were a time frame that allowed action to be measured in increments. They would see a therapist together, share access to certain messages for transparency, and create a safety code if the internet spiraled again. Hunter promised no unilateral decisions. Nina promised a cessation of behind-the-scenes maneuvers that involved Melody or rogue accounts. Outside the attic window, the city pulsed as if nothing had changed.
Inside, 2 people who had been living as ledgers and clauses agreed to a test that felt like the honest beginning they'd both avoided. The aftermath of their negotiation had to be handled publicly. They issued a joint statement that afternoon, an assertion of support for Nina, a request for privacy, and an announcement that they were working through the aftermath in private with professionals. The internet devoured it with the appetite of people who love cliffhangers. Weston's funding plan moved forward with the kind of quiet efficiency ranching life breeds, a mix of private loans, local grants, and Hunter quietly leveraging business contacts to open possibilities. Hunter's maneuver at the board, insisting on a humane official response, had surprised some of his elders, but it also reframed the narrative in a way that made the press's tone less predatory. People tired of spectacle when the spectacle contained consequences for those who made it. Melody's reaction was immediate, a flurry of performative pity, and then strategic distancing when board members looked sideways. Serena's role remained in question. The police followed the footage. Candace found a bartender willing to give a statement that someone had been seen slipping something in a glass. The net tightened. The law would take its time, as law often does, but evidence and witnesses started to build a more concrete picture than the rumor mill had provided. As the 3-month plan began, the small daily things became their real work. It was not grand declarations, but bowls of noodles, unremarkable and domestic, that started to stitch closed some of the torn edges. One evening, after a long day of interviews and appointments, Hunter cooked. He was not known for culinary skill. His kitchen was usually a place for coffee and brief meetings, but he stood over a pot of ramen and stirred with the solemnity of someone who took a new task seriously. "You cook like you calculate margins," Nina said, watching him with a tired smile. He surveyed the simple fare, then admitted, "Cooking is like a small negotiation. Salt, heat, timing. If you get it wrong the first time, you try again." They ate off paper bowls so they wouldn't have to scrub, and the act of sharing something so ordinary felt like a rebellion against the drama that had occupied their days. He laughed when she attempted a chopstick trick and failed. Someone texted them a screenshot of the moment, an absurd little victory, and Candace roasted them in the group chat. "What about the laundry?" Nina asked later, noticing the pile of clothing she had meant to drop at the cleaners. "It's yours," he said simply, "and I will run it. If we're doing this, I'm going to learn to handle the small things." He had said it without fanfare. It was a promise with a small domestic weight. She found herself accepting his help in ways she hadn't allowed before. He did not do it to mark his territory. He did it because it was what he wanted to do.
He learned to fold with less calculation and more tenderness. When he washed a sweater of hers, the one with the moth-eaten cuff he adored, the small care with which he smoothed the fabric across the basin felt almost reverent. They began couple therapy, a different kind of boardroom where feelings had to be spoken in the first person. The therapist asked them unsparing questions. Why had they agreed to the clause? What did they fear? What did they hope to recover? "You both made a choice that served others," she asked, in a voice that was neither judgmental nor forgiving, but exact. "Now you have to figure out what you need from each other without the scaffolding of negotiation." Nina said, truthfully, that she had been trying to trade something tangible, a land title, for an intangible future for Weston and her family. She admitted she'd wielded strategic silence as armor, and that in the end it had left her lonely. Hunter said, with a voice like a ledger being closed, that his silence had been armor for his fear of vulnerability. He had believed he would hurt her more by speaking than by holding back. He had miscalculated. They learned to ask for things without expecting payment. They learned to confess without hoping for absolution. Night by night, the 3 months began to look like a careful experiment in being human to one another. Humor threaded through the heavy days like bright yarn. The clouded absurdity of modern life had not left. The internet still loved a good snapshot. Hunter, in a moment of ridiculousness, sent Nina a photo to their private thread, an exaggerated selfie of his abs, filtered and ridiculous. She laughed until she cried. She sent back a photo of herself mock flexing like a bodybuilder with a cheap rubber band in her kitchen, and they both posted nothing publicly and giggled like teenagers in a secret thread. Chat: abs therapy works, 10 of 10. Chat: laundry pick or it didn't happen. The small domestic victories mattered. He learned the value of asking permission before making a cleansing move that could be read as possessive. She learned the value of letting someone know when she needed space and when she needed help. Trust, they discovered, was less an event than a series of tiny choices that could, over time, override the weight of legal clauses and family ledgers. Their 3-month agreement had public terms, a commitment to privacy, cooperation with the investigation, and mutual counseling, but its real work lived in private. Texted check-ins, honest confessions, emergency safe words, and a calendar shared so they knew when the other might face public scrutiny. They set small ground rules about social media, about Melody's involvement, about boundaries with Weston that respected both the childhood love and the new, complicated adult contract. As days passed, the viral clips cooled, contested narratives diluted, and actual evidence began to guide what people believed. Serena was questioned, Melody's motives were scrutinized, and the Quinn board's cautious stance paid off by letting the law do its job, rather than letting gossip decide. It didn't fix everything. The board's whispers still existed, and the market still cared about reputation. But the human story, Nina and Hunter trying, failing, trying again, had a rhythm that was not dictated by headline cycles. There were stumbles. Melody made a public comment that read like a jab disguised as concern, and then had to backtrack when the community rallied in support of Nina. Weston, for all his patience, had days where the boy inside him wanted a simple answer, "Are you staying?" And those days were brittle for Nina. She had to make choices that were kinder than lazy. 3 months later, when the legal and social dust had settled into a slower rhythm, they sat on the balcony where the first fights had been staged with divorce papers. The papers themselves had long been moved out of sight, into a locked drawer that neither had mentioned in weeks. The world had not stopped wanting to narrate them. It had just grown a little quieter about their private life, as if the public had decided to look away when no juicy chorus presented itself. They had not become a fairy tale. They had become, in the small ways, partners trying to invent a language for care. They had shared more than policy statements, late-night confessions, hospital visits when panic flared, apologies for things that hadn't been said when they were needed, and the sudden revelation that being known by someone else could be a shelter rather than a prison. He washed one of her shirts in the sink because she had fallen asleep on the couch after a long day, and when she woke to find it folded precisely on her nightstand, she felt a heat that was not exactly the fever of passion, but the warmth of being noticed. He took to leaving little unnecessary notes in places he guessed she'd look, a line on her mirror, a napkin in her wallet with a joke. She started to fold his shirts properly, even the ones he didn't notice. In small ways, they traded the old currency of strategic silence for a currency that paid in presence. Once, in a private moment of levity that felt like a dare, he sent one of his photos to a private group of friends with a caption, "Proof I have a torso." The thread exploded in teasing. She screenshotted it and sent it to him with a single-hearted emoji and a note, "Stop being ridiculous." He replied with a gif of a kettle. "Noodles and laundry save the world. Domestic healing montage when?" I stand the kettle gif. The last scene before the 3-month marker was small and domestic, an image rather than a climactic event. They were in the kitchen. The rain tapped at the window with a lazy rhythm. He was making coffee the way he always did, precise and serious. She was folding a laundry pile that had once represented another kind of ledger. "Do you think we'll make it?" she asked, not demanding a promise, only a measure of his honest estimate. He looked at her with the same attention he'd given shareholders and contracts for years, and then with something softer. "I think it's possible," he said.
But it will be work. It's not a guarantee. She folded the final shirt and set it on the counter. That's all I asked for, she said. No guarantees, just work. He smiled, small and real. He reached out then, hesitated, and instead of taking her hand in a manner that might have felt like a testament to reclaiming what the clause forbade, he placed his palm tentatively on the back of her hand. It was an old gesture of respect that had become intimate the moment it was allowed. She closed her fingers around his thumb. There was no cinematic music, no final gasp. The 3-year no-touch clause still existed in their contract. It was still a legal thing tied up in family agreements and a pragmatic solution for messy politics. But the one unexpected night had changed everything in a different way. It had cracked the surface of their practice distance and let something human leak through. It had made him vulnerable and her honest in ways both of them had avoided. It was not a cure. It was a beginning. They sat there together, hands lightly touching, a slow promise more substantial than any paper that had been signed. Outside, the rain softened, and the city returned to its small cruelties and quiet kindnesses. Inside, a pot had cooled on the counter. A kettle made a soft, absurd little noise in their private thread, and the future felt like a work in progress they were willing to try finishing together. One night changed everything, but the real work is just beginning. If you want to see whether trust survives the 3 months, subscribe and watch the next chapter.